So we left off talking about that new Constitution and how this new Constitution was creating a new combination of things. And I kind of highlighted that under the concept of a sovereign union of sovereign states. Now, this new federal union, how is this all going to work together? And we talked about that this is going to create a new, stronger national government at the expense of the states. And there were some people that were not going to like that. The states, right? And we had left off with this idea that the United States Constitution, as it was written here in the 1780s, was a document that absolutely had to be interpreted. But it didn't spell out who or what that body was that was going to interpret the Constitution, and that was going to spell trouble for down the road, okay? So that's pretty much where we left off. So let's dive right back in. So this national government was a much stronger national government. So for example, was there an office of president or executive head under the Articles of Confederation? Absolutely not. But under the new Constitution, there was a new president, a potentially very powerful office. I mean, the president's going to be able to appoint all sorts of very powerful federal officials. And when it came to the military, he's the commander-in-chief, right? So that's a very powerful position. Now, what power does he have in relation to Congress? Well, he has the power of veto. Now, the legislature can override his veto with a 2/3 vote, but he still has that veto power. The point to understand is that the office of the president was one of tremendous power. Now, how was the president elected according to the Constitution? Was he elected directly by the people, 100% democratically? No, he was not. The Electoral College is how the president was elected. And how were the electoral voters decided? Well, as the state legislatures decided. So let's think about this. How democratic is that? The voter, the people, at this particular point, white males, taxpayers who own property, elected the state legislature, who in turn decided how the electors would be chosen. Were these the most intelligent, enlightened, and resourceful individuals that the state could offer? Absolutely not. They're the elites in that society. And they're going to be the ones deciding who the president was going to be. And this was very deliberate. This is deliberately done to quote-unquote cool off democracy. Somebody asked George Washington, hey, why do you have this thing called the Electoral College? And he answered by saying, why do you pour hot coffee in a cup before you drink it? And the individual answered, well, in order to kind of make sure it's cool before I drink it. Washington said exactly. The Electoral College is there to cool off democracy, because when you get democracy, it's too close to the people. You get messes like you had in Rhode Island. Remember that? So from the point of view, this is so important, from the point of view of the founding fathers, they felt like democracy had gotten turned loose too soon. They really had no notion that these electors would have significant differences at all. And the way things was set up originally was that each elector would get 2 votes. They'd vote for one person and then another. And the person who got the most votes would be the president. The person who got the second highest number of votes would be the vice president. There was no separate election of vice president and president. They just thought this was going to be this high-minded, independent group of men who were going to vote for the best men for the job. There'd be no party divisions, just one big, happy family. Yeah, we know how that's going to work out. But that's how it was set up. And man, was that going to cause some trouble and have to be changed one day. Another example of the new power of the national government was that it provided for a Supreme Court. It didn't say it had the power to interpret the Constitution, but it was clear that it could be given that power if Congress so chose to do so. Remember, there was no national court system under the Articles, but under the new Constitution, you now have one. Next, this new national government gave some additional powers to that new federal Congress, like the power to tax. Under the Articles, you could not tax from the federal government. Now you could. And so a power like that of taxation, right, you will be able to accumulate resources for that military, to expand your borders, etc. It creates a stronger government. So they increased the power of the federal government in a million different ways. I just gave you a few to think about. Now, think about this. If the power of the national government has increased, what has or will happen to the power of the state governments? That's right, they're going to decrease. the state government's political power, their sovereign power, will reduce. So they're going to greatly reduce the power of the states in a variety of ways. So by increasing the power of the national government, and thus at the same time decreasing the power of the states, these people were attempting to accomplish something important. And don't get too upset with me, because I'm just telling you the truth. They were trying to control democracy. The Founding Fathers felt that the country was falling apart due to an excess of democracy, and they wanted to do something to help retard that process. They wanted to put up limits to control this. And that's not usually what we talk about in this country. Usually all we do is talk about how unbelievably democratic we are, as if we were born democratic, and we've always been that way. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Constitution that we currently serve under was originally created to restrict democracy, because as far as those Founding Fathers were concerned, there was too much democracy around. And also, the new Constitution was created to protect property. Remember from the previous lecture, if you loan me good money and I get back worthless paper money, I've lost property, right? So if the national government now can tax, can it not pay off its debt to its people? Yes, it can. So the Constitution was also there to help protect private property for these wonderful elites and Founding Fathers. Now, people have been arguing about the meaning of the Constitution ever since it was created. And from one point of view, it holds that the Founding Fathers were selfless patriots who were saving the U.S. from disintegration. They were above all self-interest. They were like patriotic gods saving America. So there's one. And that's probably what some of us were taught in our grade school and middle school and high school. Well, okay. And maybe there's some elements of truth in some aspects of that. But there's also another point of view from a historian by the name of Charles Beard. There's a Beard there on your screen. Again, I'm not asking you to buy into any of these theories. I'm just giving you different theories to consider. In the 1930s, Beard put forth what we can call an economic interpretation of the Constitution. Beard said, wait a minute. The Founding Fathers were rich men with a lot of property. They were worried that democracy was running wild. They wanted to control it, to protect property. But Beard went further. Beard said that when they did this, they betrayed the American Revolution, because the American Revolution was about expanding democracy, letting people redistribute property. The Founding Fathers, according to Beard, were counter-revolutionaries, people who were trying to roll back the changes wrought by the revolution itself. So to Beard, our Founding Fathers became the bad guys. Now, there's a lot of argument over that. It's time that someone gave you the truth. And of course, there's only one person that can do that, Dr. Mitch. But seriously, let's look at this and try to make some sense of it. So was it a betrayal of the revolution, according to Beard? Look, sure, the Founding Fathers wanted to save the country. Of course they did. Were they concerned about their financial interest? Of course they were. They're human. When was the last time any of us was not concerned with our financial state? So sure, they wanted to restrict democracy. They wanted to protect property. They said so. I told you so. I read you quotes. But here's where Beard is wrong, I think. What they did was not to betray the American Revolution. You see, I think when you say that, you've gone too far. So let's understand this. Yeah, the founders were property-loving conservatives that wanted to roll back democracy, but they weren't betraying the American Revolution. Because what was the American Revolution about? Assuming I told you the truth, which of course I did the American Revolution begin because people like Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, and others are running around saying, Britain's not letting us be democratic enough. We want to broaden democracy in America. We want to let women vote. We want to free all the slaves. Was this what the American Revolution was about? I promise you, the American Revolution was never about spreading democracy. That was not why it happened. It was about keeping a good thing. So the American Revolution wasn't about spreading democracy. Democracy was only a byproduct of it, like that Declaration of Independence. And secondly, was the American Revolution about taking property away from the rich people and letting poor people have it? Absolutely not. When you say no taxation without representation, What is the taxation taking away from people? Yeah, their property, their money. Did rich people who bet on the Revolution, like Washington and Jefferson, lose their property and have it redistributed? Absolutely not. So yeah, the Constitution limited democracy. It protected private property, but it was not a betrayal of the Revolution, because the Revolution was not about expanding democracy or threatening private property. It was about protecting property. So again, Machen says the Constitution was not a betrayal of the Revolution. It was a perfect representation of what the early United States were. Well, look, I'm through ranting about this, and I'll let your text walk you through the ratification process and the addition of those first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And while you read through that, pay attention to those Federalists and Anti-Federalists, but I will kind of give you a quick summary of what you'll be reading about. So the Constitution was written, but it still had to go out to the states for ratification. Now the fight broke down into two camps, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were those that were pro-Constitution, pro-ratification of the Constitution. But be careful by saying, flippant things that the Anti-Federalists were against any kind of national government. No, they just weren't for this Constitution the way it was written. Just remember, don't jump to conclusions that the Anti-Federalists were solely against any type of central government. It's true that the Anti-Federalists were for a government that gave more power back to the individual states, but they did concede that some type of central government was needed. Now, a lot of the fight between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists broke out in the newspapers over this Constitution in the form of written propaganda. And I'm only going to mention the most famous part of that propaganda. And it revolves around three people who favored the Constitution, led by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they decided they would write a series of newspaper articles describing the Constitution and how it was going to work. They started in 1787, and eventually there would be more than 80 articles that were signed with the same name of Publius, the famous Roman Republican orator. These articles were collected and published in the book in 1788. They called it the Federalist Papers. If you want to know what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote the Constitution, this is what you read, because it was the most important pro-Constitution propaganda put out in this time period. Now, this fight over ratification began in 1787, and by the middle of 1788, 9 states had ratified through a series of state-held conventions in which the states individually voted to ratify or not. And by June of 88, 9 had ratified the new Constitution. So technically, it could go in right then and there. But the problem was 2 of the bigger states, New York and Virginia, had not ratified it. And so it really would take the involvement of people like Washington personally in Virginia, where he was from, and Alexander Hamilton in New York to personally get involved where he was from, to get those states to ratify. Because you're not going to have a very strong United States of America if New York and Virginia stay out. Okay? But in any event, we finally got our Constitution ratified, and it was approved and added and put into place by 1789. Those first 10 amendments were added by 1791, and those were just restrictions on the power of the federal government that were included in this Constitution to get states like New York and Virginia to ratify, to lessen their fears. Okay? But again, I'll leave it to your textbook to kind of fly you through that. So I just went through real quickly to summarize some of the things you'd be looking at. And so the last thing I want to talk to you about when it comes to this Constitution deals with the relationship between slavery and the Constitution. Specifically, what I want you to understand was the conflict and the resulting compromises relative to the issue of slavery as discussed, as enacted by the framers in this Constitutional Convention. I mean, it seems slavery was a very useful tool used by pro- and anti-slavery forces in their attempts to bargain for their objectives in the constitutional propaganda debates. And this was most evident in the Constitution's representation clause concerning slavery. The question as to whether or not slaves counted towards a state's congressional presence was a controversial debate, to say the least, in this time period. The answer, unfortunately, was not a clear-cut yes or no. It simply depended upon the political circumstance. Northern politicians supported slave representation, only if it were to increase tax measures in the South. The final result was a compromise, the infamous Three-Fifths Clause. The fact that slavery was such an instrumental tool in these early debates of the 1780s only supports the thesis that slavery was a very important political hot potato during and immediately after the American Revolution. Now, there was no great movement in America to abolish slavery in the 1780s. And when the Constitutional Convention met, that's not happening. To be sure, there were opponents of slavery, and I'll mention a few in a minute, on a philosophical level. But the abolition movement did not appear until the 1830s, when the American Anti-Slavery Society was put together by William Lloyd Garrison, that we'll talk about later in this class, writing the organization's nascent Statement of Principles. But prior to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, many of our founding fathers expressed opinions that actually did condemn slavery. Calls for immediate emancipation or less radical suggestions for gradual emancipation were met with considerable resistance during this revolutionary phase. Southerners' strongest argument against manumission, freeing of slaves, concerned the existence of blacks in a white society. In other words, what are we going to do with these former slaves when they're free? And these fears were only compounded as Northern abolitionists protected and assisted fleeing fugitive slaves. And this actually helped create an ever-present condition of a free black community in the North that you'll see in your readings that becomes a beacon of hope for slaves in the South. A key example of a founder who worked to eliminate slavery is our good friend here, Alexander Hamilton. People forget that about Hamilton. Articles, books, you name it, have done a really good job refuting the prevailing scholarly view that Hamilton, like most of our founders, generally lacked a deep concern about slavery, when in fact he truly did. Hamilton understood that the natural rights of man imposed a corresponding duty to end slavery, and he actually endorsed the idea of compensated emancipation. In other words, he wanted the federal government to buy slaves from their owners and free them. His opinions of the Constitution, his conduct of American foreign policy, his involvement in state abolition societies, and his economic policies demonstrate that he wanted to end slavery in the United States. After the Revolutionary War, more significant efforts to end slavery occurred in some states, which were free at this point finally to legislate on this matter. And you would see a lot of these abolition and manumission societies pop up. In fact, in New York, Hamilton's home seemed a particularly hot spot for these societies, where it possessed quite a few slaves north of the Mason-Dixon line. So accordingly, the New York Society for Promoting the Manumission of Slaves was organized as early as 1785, with Hamilton as a key member, and our old friend John Jay was elected its president. Hamilton's committee proposed that members undertake a gradual emancipation where the federal government would involve itself in buying off these slaves and freeing them. But, of course, these concepts, these appeals to the federal government, these appeals for equality and freedom of our slaves in the United States fell on deaf ears. Because as was his wont, my friends, and we'll hear a lot about Alexander Hamilton later, he was pushing too hard, too fast. And lastly, it's often been assumed that the sole reason for these compromises rested solely with the agricultural base in the South and its relationship with the emerging manufacturing base in the North, all those textile industries. In other words, the Constitution has often been called a living tribute to the art of compromise. I think so. And I think the slavery question is the strongest example of that. And you'll see a lot of that in your readings in your textbook. And so we'll stop there.